For everyone who's just tuning in, we have Peter Staley, the AIDS activist, and one of the primary subjects of the documentary How to Survive a Plague, more important and more relevant than ever. And I just learned a couple hours ago that today is the 33-year anniversary of the very first ACT UP action, which was March 24th at Wall Street. Were you at that first action?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't even a member yet. But I worked as a bond trader on Wall Street at Morgan Guarantee, which was one. It was at the corner of Wall and Broad. And on my way to work, I got handed a flyer from an ACT UP member about the demonstration that was about to happen, like within an hour. And everybody on the trading floor was talking about it because everybody got handed these flyers. And so I saw them on the nightly news that night, and I knew I was already, I was closeted. I knew I was HIV positive. I was desperate. So when I saw them on the news, I got really excited and said, this is something I got to be a part of. So I got myself to the very next meeting and never looked back.
Yeah, yeah, and I think
I brought some wine. I don't
Oh,
have
excellent! I'm jealous. It's not quite 5 o'clock yet in LA, so in a few hours. But I'll be there in spirit with my iced coffee. So
Okay.
But yeah, just rewinding a little bit. So you said you were already working on Wall Street, and ACT UP came along a few years after. For the people who don't know out there, a few years after the AIDS crisis began. And so my question is, once these cases started appearing. And, you said you were closeted, but what was it like in those early years?
Well, I got to New York in the spring of '83, fresh out of Oberlin College, with a new job offer from Morgan Guarantee, and deeply closeted, obviously. Let's see, '83, I was 22 years old. And all that stuff that happened with the Normal Heart and Larry Kramer and GMHC in the first 2 years of the crisis, '81 to '83, I didn't know. I hadn't heard of any of that. Most young millennial gay men in New York were going about their lives. They were going to the bars. The bathhouses were still open. Unless you were really connected into unless you were really out and really connected into the gay world and reading the New York Blade every week. And you were kind of clueless to this. And the reason we were clueless is because we heard nothing from anybody in authority. The mayor didn't say anything. The governor didn't say anything. And God knows Reagan didn't say anything. So there were no public health warnings. There had been some early news reports, very few in the New York Times and some other places. By that, there had been one network news broadcast in all of 1982, I believe. Just, it's fucking crazy. And so we heard that something was going around. By '83, it had a name. It was called AIDS. But we could be pretty dismissive about it. Believe it or not, the things we told ourselves in the bars were kind of like what those kids were saying down on the beaches of Florida the past few weeks. We were saying stuff like, oh, it really only seems to be happening to the older gay guys who have slept with hundreds of guys. We don't really have to worry about that. So, youth.
Yeah, yeah. To be the ignorance is bliss until it isn't, until it's not. So that brings us to ACT UP, and for a lot of people in my generation, I know maybe they've seen the Silence Equals Death logo. They might be familiar with the triangle or just some of this idea of AIDS activism, but I know at least for me, when I was younger and coming to grips with my own sexuality, it was just something that, I was frankly scared of. Is this part of our history? And I think now, as we realize, actually, this is a time when it should be inspiring us to act back and act up. It's more important than ever. So, for people who don't know or maybe haven't done the research, can you tell me a little bit about what ACT UP was and your first days in it?
Yeah. So we were formed in March of '87, which was, as you pointed out, years into the crisis. It was 6 years into the crisis. So, um, so that really goes back to that early denial that most of the community was going through, and the fact that the government wasn't saying anything. It really took it took to like what we're beginning to feel now with coronavirus, where today we heard about Terrence McNally. We're beginning to hear about people we know who are dying. Um, you know, I know Terrence McNally, and I'm pretty shook up by this news. This is one of America's greatest playwrights, and he's written a great deal. He wrote many plays that were focused on AIDS, and I think he avoided getting HIV himself during all those years, and then to be felled by this. Um, so until we got to that point with AIDS, which was like 84, 85, by that point, every gay man knew someone who was sick or had died. And that's when we started getting very, very scared. We were not, we had no experience being a, you know, aggressive political force nationally. And we were always afraid of a backlash if we tried to do anything like that, because we were such a despised community. So it took a lot of death and fear and pent up anger before we got up the courage to just say, fuck it, we've got to take to the streets. And it was like Larry Kramer popped a balloon. It was exploded in anger. So it was 6 years in, and once it happened, though, it was like it was unstoppable. And from the very first meetings in March of '87, they were large meetings. There were over 100 people, and I got there like the third or fourth meeting, and I could tell right away. But the very first meeting I was at, that everybody knew that we were making history. There wasn't some illusion like, oh, will this amount to much? We knew right away that this is something the gay community had not done to this extent and with this determination and with this level of anger since Stonewall. And the death count wasn't going to go away. It was only going to get worse. So we were going to make history. And there was that palpable sense in the room. And so we decided to be a very democratic, open movement that eschewed formal leadership. We weren't going to have a board of directors or designated leaders. We were going to be a true people's movement of the community. And committees were formed, and we had the issues committee, the actions committee, the outreach committee were like the first three. And then we just started taking to the streets and doing one demonstration after the other. And by the next year, the whole country had heard of us. So we were the Black Lives Matter or the Occupy of our time. We were the movement that the whole country was hearing about and seeing. Almost on a monthly basis, they would see an AIDS demonstration on the news.
Yeah, and speaking of those demonstrations, up until that point, we've been talking about early demonstrations, including, those organized by Bayard Rustin and Frank Kameny and some of these, activists who set the stage for these getting on the street actions. Why was it that ACT UP turned to those very theatrical, confrontational tactics versus, writing letters to your congressman or lobbying or some of these things that you see our community turning to now, why were these more very militant actions preferred and useful?
Well, we had to break through a wall of ignorance and outright hatred, um, and we felt we had no time to do it. We felt that we were late to the, we had gotten a very late start. The death rate was already ridiculous, and so we had to do things incredibly fast and incredibly loud and incredibly aggressive. We couldn't wait around and, do some 3-year campaign to make people love us.
Mm-hmm.
So we needed to do spectacular actions that we very purposely wanted to be a national movement. We wanted the country to see us. So we played to the media, and we had to give them stunning visuals that would lead the news. And so that's what we did. We shut down the FDA for an entire day with 1,000 activists doing all sorts of creative theater surrounding the building. And God knows we are a creative people. So, and we had a lot of theater queens.
Yeah.
And so we could put on a show. And it was like a 12-ring circus around the FDA with all these, we gave the cameras plenty of footage to work with. And the country had never seen anything like that. They'd seen it once before for one 24-hour news cycle. They saw the White Night riot after Dan White was given a slap on the wrist.
Right.
After the Harvey Milk assassination, San Francisco blew up, had some riots, torched some police cars. An amazing historical moment, as you know, in gay history. And that got lots of national news. But 48 hours later, it was gone.
Right.
So that was probably the only moment in American history. Stonewall was not televised at all. So that was the only time they had seen large numbers of queer people angry and passionate. We did that every month.
Right.
Put on some, without the violence, but putting on a show of patients, sympathetic show of people who were dying, and letting the country know that they were letting thousands of Americans die. They were just letting it happen because they were ignoring an epidemic. And so our first job as a movement was to give the whole country a gigantic guilt trip about those deaths, and to break through that homophobia. And it worked. Within a year, Gallup showed that polling on Americans on how they viewed homosexuals dramatically shifted. And what shifted the most was when you asked them, should we be spending more on AIDS? And that went through the roof. 80% and plus said yes.
Wow.
And that forced Reagan and Bush to start spending real money. And we saw the NIH budget from 87, when ACT UP was formed, until 1990, 3 years later, the NIH budget tripled and topped $1 billion a year for AIDS research. And by that point, there were editorials appearing in the New York Times complaining about how much money was going to AIDS. So we shifted things really fast. And you couldn't have done that with letters to Congress.
Right.
No.
Right.
I can't remember if it was Morty Manford or someone who said that one direct action, one zap is worth a year's on the therapist's couch just because of its empowering effects also. Um, but so one thing that I noticed in the documentary, rewatching it, is just how involved, especially you and TAG, the Treatment Action Group, was in actually getting your foot in the door of, the National Institutes of Health and that actual research process. So why was it so important for you and other citizens who were not trained as physicians or researchers to actually be involved in that process?
Right. So once we got the FDA to loosen up and we got the federal government to start spending real bucks, it quickly became apparent that there were multiple players involved in a very complex job ahead of everyone of trying to discover all of HIV's weak spots. This was before they could easily isolate all the genes of a virus like they did with coronavirus in a week. We weren't able to, the technology wasn't there for that. So it was a real methodical looking for HIV's weaknesses, trying to find drugs that would target each of those weaknesses, convincing pharmaceutical companies that were involved to go faster, convincing the NIH to go faster, letting us in the door and at having a seat at the table for all the discussions. It got very complex very fast. And the only way we were going to be listened to is if all those other players quickly became convinced that we knew what we were talking about. So we had to become as expert as they were, if not more expert, because they're all in their individual little silos, in a sense, focused on one piece of the problem. We could look at the whole pie and spend all our time studying it and figuring out how all the pieces fit. It took us a good year and a half to 2 years before we had that expertise internally. And it really proved to me that no matter what your schooling or your prior classwork or what you've studied, or even, how you don't have to be a genius even. If you're really determined and have some time and passionate about something, you can become an expert pretty quick if you put your nose to the grindstone. Nobody should feel too intimidated by any science or any, like climate science or any of that. Dive in and get into it and read all you can and start listening to others and working with others, and you will become your own expert pretty quickly. We were studying, we got the textbooks on virology and immunology, and we had these geeky classes every week where I didn't go to those, but I was more the politics guy and the and how to talk to pharma guy, but we had loads of geeks that were just devouring all of that stuff. And so when we met with Fauci, we would have Mark Harrington there, who would just shock Fauci with how much he knew. How much he knew about the basic science Fauci was doing in his lab, down to the molecular genetic level. And so that's how you impress. Yeah, that's how we got our seat at the table.
Right. And you already mentioned some of your successes, which was, of course, the increase in funding, the monumental increase in funding. But I'm curious if there's, one moment or one direct action or a time where you were most proud of what you had accomplished.
Well, I like to, first off, I think anything any of us did individually, none of us could have done without the power of the collective. All of individualism just didn't come into the picture very much. So what I'm most proud of is what we did as a collective, as a movement, and I'm proud to have been a part of that. And obviously, the biggest thing that ACT UP accomplished was getting those research dollars and pushing the entire research establishment to find those targets, to find those drugs, and to come up with a breakthrough regimen in 1996 that dropped the death rate in the U.S. and throughout Europe by 80% in 2 years. And those drugs started getting distributed around the world, and now about half the people with HIV around the world are taking those combination therapies and are alive because of that activism. So that, we're talking 22 million people now saved because of that activism. So and we did a lot of things, but that's the headline.
Yeah, and we have, people watching and giving comments, and they're all saying thank you so much for your service. So thank you, and to anyone who might be watching who was an AIDS activist during that very scary time, for what you have done for generations like mine who now can benefit and sleep knowing that we have this medicine largely because of direct action. And that brings us to now. And one thing we briefly touched on yesterday was that some of the key players, at least in the government and medicinal world, are the same people, including the person you mentioned, Dr. Fauci. So some of the questions I've actually been getting from some of my own followers, and I'm not really entirely sure of how ACT UP and other activists viewed Fauci, whether he was now that he's on the coronavirus task force in a very similar role, is he someone that the LGBTQ plus community can look at as someone we trust as a hero, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, he was somebody. It is a little more complicated. I think those of us who dealt with him most closely during the early years and continue to deal with him now, we all fell in love with the guy and have huge respect. It became very obvious right away that not only his mind was in the game, but his heart was in the game. This is he's been head of NIAID since '84, since the earliest years of the epidemic. And the NIH has a hospital there. So during the worst of the plague years in AIDS, that hospital was filled with gay men dying from AIDS in clinical trials. And every day Fauci would do rounds there and check in on those patients. There are a few, like some of the head doctors at Ward 5 in San Francisco, for instance, and that, lost hundreds and hundreds of patients. He is one of those doctors. He's as deeply scarred from the plague years as any of us. And he is 79 and is determined to stay on the job until, the last he told me, until like at least 80, when he's 85 or longer.
Wow.
He wants to, because he's very healthy, he really wants to be there when we get a vaccine or not a sterilizing cure, but a functional cure for HIV. And he thinks we'll get there. And I know that's why he's staying. And that's why he's there now for coronavirus. But he was somebody with a great deal of power during those years, but not as much power as people think. So ACT UP put him between a rock and a hard place. We were the rock, and the hard place were lead virologists and immunologists that had that were older than him and had more awards than he did. He was a young doctor. He was this young head of NIAID. that were in charge of the AIDS clinical trials group. He didn't get to decide what his own department did from a clinical trial perspective during the AIDS years. He had some influence, but there were this board of scientists that made all these decisions, and they were and he had to politically maneuver them. And so when we demanded a seat at their table, and they said, "Fuck that! Are you fucking crazy? Those patients are those people are crazy. They're like violent and they're nuts." And Fauci was getting to know us, and he knew we weren't nuts. So, and we were saying, "Get us that seat. Get us that seat." So we put him in these pinchers, and he didn't. When he didn't work fast, when he didn't get what we want fast enough, we would demonstrate in front of his building and burn him in. We'd burn the guy in effigy.
Yeah.
Even though we loved him. So it was a weird dichotomy.
Yeah, very, very complicated relationship, but it sounds like with a happy ending. And I know there's been some tension between him and the president now. So hopefully, with the knowledge that he's a good guy and in our camp, we'll do what we can to protect him. And that brings up the next question, which is, in this time of fear and a very similar situation in terms of people starting, like you mentioned to the news this morning, of people starting to pass away from this virus. What do you think are some of the biggest lessons that we can learn as, gay men, as part of a larger LGBTQ plus community from the AIDS crisis, and apply them now?
Well, sadly, one of the biggest lessons is that every epidemic is made worse by fuckhead politicians. It just happens every time. And I'm very frightened that we're about to see, Trump dropped the ball during the first month, and now he's just turned it into a propaganda thing to make him look like a wartime president. And he might make a gigantic mistake of loosening up on social isolation too early, too soon. He seems to be making a decision that he's willing to let thousands of older Americans and people with underlying conditions die for a higher stock market price. And if that doesn't make you angry, I don't know what will. But activism is much harder now that we're all stuck at home.
Right.
I've heard one great idea that we could do. There have been some great demonstrations in history with automobiles, everybody creating gigantic traffic jams. That's a safe demonstration right now. If we all go down and turn Washington, D.C. into a parking lot and honk our horns at the same time. There are various ideas, but online right now, do what ACT UP did. Follow the science, believe it, become your own experts, fight against cynicism, fight against conspiracy theories, begin to trust expertise and reliable sources. We really need all these tools to fight back. So there's a lot of crazy shit happening online right now with this discussion. And the smart people have to win this. We all, if the cynics take over and the trolls win these arguments online, we're fucked. So don't feed the trolls.
Yeah.
Get to make sure you're reaching out and having long chats, FaceTime with old friends, new friends. Stay strong. Protect your own mental health. one of the reasons I think I'm alive is because I religiously protected, got selfish about my own mental health during the ACT UP years. I just made that a priority, and and I'm trying to do that now. So yeah, stay strong. We can stay together.
Yeah, amen to that. I don't know if you have time for one more question. I've been following the questions from some of the listeners, and I know one thing that you have been involved in, just from studying up on you, is the question of prep. And one of the questions that I've just seen someone ask is what your opinions are on that, especially now as people are starting to wonder whether it's safe in this time.
Safe to have sex?
Safe to for the medicine Truvada.
Prep has always been safe. Yeah, prep is a miracle drug. Truvada prep, Descovy prep, they're miracle drugs. Absolute miracle drugs. If something like Truvada prep had come out in 1987, we would have burned the FDA down if they hadn't approved it right away. And there wouldn't have been no debates. There wouldn't have been any of these moral debates. We wouldn't have had Michael Weinstein and AIDS Healthcare Foundation saying stupid shit. We would have all taken that drug and saved our lives. So if you're HIV negative and you're sexually active, take PrEP. End of conversation. The toxicity profile compares with aspirin, swear to God. And so it's a non-debate. But there is a question right now as we're doing social isolation, whether we should be having any anonymous hookups or hookups outside of our isolated household. And that's a real thing.
Right.
And I think for a while we should put the brakes on that. And if you're lucky enough to be quarantined with a partner or a fuck buddy, I'm very jealous.
No comment.
But we do have, I mean, we're not going to do it right now, but we do have videos like this, and we can get into that, right? So.
This is where the internet is very useful in all sorts of interactions, social and otherwise. So
exactly.
Well, thank you so much.
On that note,
yeah. On that note. The wonders of the internet and social interaction and a glass of wine, which I might go get myself. But I think on behalf of all of our listeners and the entire, as a gay man in our entire LGBTQ plus community and everyone in the world who is afflicted by HIV/AIDS continuing to now, thank you so much for your service. Truly millions of lives affected by you and you literally putting your body on the line. So thank you so much for that and also for joining us. And a note to everyone else who is listening or who may have just tuned in, I'll be posting this entire interview as a video and also with high quality audio as a podcast, so you can tune in if you didn't catch the whole thing. So again, Peter, thank you so much and stay healthy. Enjoy that glass of wine for me. I'll be joining in about 15 minutes.
Great. Stay safe, Eric.
All right, you too. Take care. Thanks again. All right, bye y'all.